Oh, it's good to be back. Wow, I've been gone for a long time. My wife had COVID at the beginning of December, and then on Christmas Day, I got the gift of COVID. It wasn't even on my Christmas list, and Santa Claus was gracious enough to give me that. It was like I got coal in my stocking for the very first time. And then I went on vacation, and man, it's good to be back. And I tell you what, I am probably more excited about the series we're jumping into than I've ever been about a series before. And I get excited about series. I do. I get excited about the Bible. We're in the book of John, and the content of the book of John is incredible. But I'm also excited about the method, how we're going to go through it. We're going to do it just a little bit different. I don't know how many of you guys got a Bible. Did you guys get a little book of John, a little Gospel of John when you walked in? So this is different from the Bible in that it's just one of the books, right? It's just one of the books. It's the book of John. And what it has is on one side, it will have the scriptures, and the other side, it'll have a blank page with lines so you can make notes. Yeah. So this is something, I don't know how you feel about like marking in the Bible, but this is one of those that is intended for you to mark in. There are going to be things you're going to highlight, things you're going to circle, things you're going to underline, things you're going to put brackets around. What I want this to be is completely and utterly marked up by the time that we get finished with this. What we're going to do is we're going to become detectives. How many of you guys are fans of detectives? You guys who's a Sherlock Holmes fan? Sherlock Holmes, what a great character. There are a number of other characters in different shows that are Sherlock Holmes that aren't called Sherlock Holmes. But the Sherlock Holmes character is a very interesting character. And here's why this matters. How many of you, when I say the word study, like rainbows and butterflies come into your mind? You're like, oh, this is great. I love to study. Okay, we have a few people that love to study. Bless you. You have no excuse for studying the Bible. For not studying the Bible. If you like to study and you don't study the Bible, you have no excuse. For the rest of us who don't like to study, you have an excuse, it's just a bad one, okay? Now, I get it though, I get it. I didn't like to study growing up. I didn't like homework. I didn't like busy work. I didn't like all of that stuff. I didn't like it at all. But what I've discovered, I took this class called hermeneutics, which is kind of basically learning to study the Bible when I was in seminary. And this professor, Howard Hendricks, was incredible. And he instilled in me a love to study the Bible. He opened my eyes to the beauties of what I could on my own and I could together in community discover. Like there's so much here. It is brilliant and it's beautiful. And this it's not just interesting, it's not just fun to study the Bible, but studying the Bible is transformative. See, the Bible doesn't just talk about who God is. It doesn't just answer the incredible questions of who is God? What is God like? What does God think about me? What does he feel about me? It does answer those questions, but the Bible is a unique book in that it's not just something you read, but it begins to read you. You know what I'm talking about? It begins to reveal you. It tells you, who are you? Who am I? What is my purpose? Can my life have meaning? Can it have significance? Can I leave a legacy, not just for the future, but into eternity? The Bible answers the most fundamental questions, and yet it also transforms our hearts and our minds. It is the number one tool that the Spirit of God uses to transform us. God reveals himself, and he reveals us, and he shows the beauty of who he is and how he interacts with us in the scriptures. So I want us to study the Bible together. Now, the way that the Bible teaches us to engage with it is a word called meditation. Now, meditation is a word that's gotten a bad rap. You think of, sitting, crisscross applesauce and holding your hands up and humming and closing your eyes and thinking of nothing. That's meditation. That's not meditation. What meditation is, the way that the Jewish people did it, or the Hebrews did it, as they engaged in the Hebrew scriptures, is that they would read it over and over and over and over again. They would think about it. They would chew on it. They would ask questions about it. And you see this in the book of Psalms. Psalm 1 says, blessed is the person who delights in the scriptures. Blessed is the person who meditates on them day and night. Deuteronomy 6 says God is God talking. He says, I'm giving you the scriptures, and here's how I want you to do. I want you to put them in your heart. I want them to be so close to you, so much a part of your life that they're on your heart. I want you to talk about them all the time. When you're walking, when you're sitting, when you're lying down, when you wake up, when you go to bed. I want you to teach them to people, teach them to your children. I want this to be a part of your life, saturating your life, getting into your mind and into your heart and transforming who you are. And that's what we're going to do. And so we're going to do things a little bit differently, but first, before we jump into kind of how we're doing this, I want to set the stage of where we are. Hey, we're in a series called The Story of the Bible. And we've been walking through this since September or October. At the beginning, we looked at the story of the Bible through the lens of Genesis chapter 1. And the story of the Bible is a story of God creating heaven and earth to be united under the rule of God and humans together, which is a beautiful beginning to the story, a beautiful intention to the story. But we find out very early on that that incredible, hopeful reality is never realized. Right? Humans say, we don't want to rule with you, God. We don't want to listen to you. We don't want you to define good and evil. We want to define good and evil on our own terms. We don't want to listen to you. We don't want to submit to you. We don't want to rule with you. We want to do it on our own. And what happens is all kind of sin just filters throughout the world. And we find that the story from that point on is the story of the Messiah, which is a Hebrew word which means anointed king. It's the story of the Messiah who will pass the test, conquer sin and death, and reunite heaven and earth under the rule of God and humans together. And what you see happen through the Hebrew scriptures, or what we would call the Old Testament, you see, it's like this. I don't know if you've ever seen those portraits that are just a silhouette of a person. I remember when we were younger, my mom got these done of us, and she hung them up, and you can tell by the silhouette which kid it was, which one of us it was, but there's no detail in it. It's just a silhouette. And what the Old Testament does, what the Hebrew scriptures do, is it begins to form this silhouette of this person who will be the Messiah. But you don't know who the Messiah is. And when Jesus steps onto the scene, he fits perfectly into that silhouette. And this is what the story of the Bible is. It's the story of Jesus. And we're going to see this through the book of John. Now, there are a number of great resources out there to help us learn how to study. One of my favorites is the Bible Project. You've heard me mention it a number of times. But one thing the Bible Project does is they put up visual maps. And we've got one of these visual maps of the book of John. They put together these visual maps to help you see and understand what the book is about. They have them for all the different books of the Bible. I love to watch these videos. They have these videos, too, that explain these maps. So I encourage you, when you go home, go to thebibleproject.com, look for this video on John. I think it's actually in 2 parts, and watch it. And it'll help explain to you what's going on in the book of John, give you a good overview, so as you engage on your own, it'll be really helpful. What we find is that the theme of the book of John is later on. It's in chapter 20. It's the second to last chapter of the Bible. In chapter 20, on this next slide, 30 through 31, it says this. John is writing, he says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." So John, one of Jesus' disciples, he refers to himself in the book as the one whom Jesus loved. He saw lots of things. He experienced lots of things. He heard Jesus say lots of things. And he said, I didn't write down all those things. There's too many to write down, right? But there are certain details I included. There are certain conversations that I included. There are certain miracles I included. He calls them signs. There are certain signs that I included intentionally for this purpose. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, right? That he fills out the silhouette, that he is the anointed king, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is the purpose of the book. So as we study it together, and as you study it on your own, keep that in mind. John wrote down certain stories and certain details and certain miracles so that we would believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that we would have life in his name. Jesus calls it life abundant, life to its fullest extent. Now, the book of John, on this next slide, we can see is separated into 16 different segments. It's harder to see on the map, so I just put together a slide that kind of help us see these 16 different segments. And we're going to go one segment each week. We'll have 16. We'll go up to the week right after Easter. And the first segment is the introduction. The introduction is chapter 1. And really, the introduction is chapter 1, verse 1 through 18. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The rest of the chapter 1, verse 19 through 51, you get to read and study on your own, which is going to be really exciting. And I just encourage you to look for all the things that are said about Jesus, who Jesus is. There are a number of things that people call Jesus in that second segment, and those are going to be really interesting. Find those, underline them, highlight them. But I want to show you a portrait of one of our presidents, the 32nd president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the great presidents of our time. He served 4 terms in office, and he led our country through some of the most difficult times, the Great Depression, World War II. He would have these radio programs called fireside chats where he'd just sit down with the microphone and just talk us through these scary times with our country. And he gave people a lot of peace. He gave people a lot of comfort in these uncertain times. And this woman, Elizabeth Shumatoff, was asked to do his portrait because her friend who knew FDR said they've done portraits of him before, but no one has been able to really capture his expression. No one has really been able to portray his dignity. No one has really been able to display in portrait form the greatness of this president. Now, no pressure, right? No pressure. No one can do it, but maybe you can really display the greatness of this man as you do this portrait. And so she sat down with him. He sat down at noon, and she began to paint his portrait in watercolor. About an hour or so later, he has lunch. And during lunch, while he's eating lunch, he gets this headache. He slumps his head, goes unconscious, never regains consciousness, and dies about an hour later. And you look at this work of art, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful in its own right, but it's an unfinished work of art. You think about the aspirations that she had in painting this picture, in painting this grand portrait, and yet we can't see it come to fruition. We can't see the finishing touches. We can't see the finishing of his expression, the completion of this work of art. And it kind of makes you sad. Like we're never going to get to see this finished, never going to get to see it completed. This is the way that I think about the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament are an incredible work of art, intentionally designed, crafted, and beautiful. But it's a story without an ending, right? It's the story of God creating heaven and earth to be united under the rule of God and humans together. But you get to the end of the Old Testament, and heaven and earth are not united. God and humans are not ruling together like God intended. You see, it's the story of the Messiah. And throughout this, the scriptures, you see this portrait being painted of the Messiah, but at the end of it, no Messiah has come. It's a story without an ending. And I'm thinking, if I were one of the Israelites, the Jewish people living during the day of Jesus, man, what would I feel about my story, my history, my generations that have this great, hopeful start, but it never happens? The Messiah never comes. The history is never brought to completion. And John steps into the scene and begins to write his book at this point. So John was one of Jesus' disciples and one of his closest disciples. He had all these encounters and experiences with Jesus. And I thought it was so fascinating that this gospel is the last gospel written. So we have 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what we call Synoptic Gospels. So if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke back to back, you'll say, wait a second, there are so many similarities. They are very similar. They tell most of the same stories. They have a lot of the same sayings of Jesus. They're very similar. Now, they fill each other out a little bit. You know, Matthew adds the Sermon on the Mount. Luke adds some other stuff that Jesus did and said. Now imagine John. one of Jesus' closest disciples, who's been radically transformed by this man who is God, who rose from the grave. And now, years later, he's been thinking about and chewing on Jesus' life. And he's probably come into possession of one of the Gospels, if not all of the Gospels, and he's read them. And he thought to himself, there's stuff missing that is vital. He thinks about the encounters he had with Jesus, the things that he saw, the encounters that Jesus had with other people. He thinks about the miracles that Jesus performed, and he thinks there's stuff missing for his future followers, for these people, for us to one day truly believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. There's things they need to know. I've got to write this stuff down so that we will get the opportunity to truly believe and encounter the one that he encountered, to see what he saw, to hear what he heard, and to be transformed by the man who transformed him. That's the book of John. And this is the book that we're going to study. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go ahead and grab your book of John. And we're going to read the first 18 verses in chapter 1 together. This is the introduction. And then we're going to go through them verse by verse, section by section. He begins like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. We know him as John the Baptist. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to begin to be detectives. We're going to begin to observe, and like Sherlock Holmes, not just observe, but also deduct. Take these details and say, what do they mean? And how does the Spirit of God want to use them to transform our lives? But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch translations as we study today. And here's why I'm doing this, very intentionally. I don't know how much you know about biblical translations, but there are a number of Bible translations. And each Bible translation kind of has its own little flair. But there are two major categories of Bible translations. There are ones that value the actual Hebrew and Greek words that were written, that God breathed out through Luke or John or Peter or whomever. And there are those that value the thoughts and ideas that came out of those words. And here's why this matters. If you are going to translate something from Spanish to English or French to English or English to Mandarin, typically what you want to do is you want to translate what the person means. And so oftentimes you won't always translate the exact words, right? Sometimes you will change the words, sometimes you will leave out words, sometimes you will add words to help you understand the meaning. Well, we believe that both are valuable. We believe that the actual words God inspired are important, and we believe the thoughts and ideas he wanted to convey are important. So I say you use multiple translations. Word for word translations, the best one there is New American Standard Bible. But as a word for word translation, it's a little bit clunky and doesn't always sound great in English. It doesn't always speak the way that we would speak because it was written in ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew. The other good ones are ESV, NIV, NRSV. Those are good word-for-word translations. And then idea or thought for thoughts are like the New Living Translation or the Message Bible. Those are also good. I would just use multiple ones. And when you use multiple translations, you'll notice differences. And that should get you to your most important tool in studying the Bible. You want to know what your most important tool in studying the Bible is besides the Spirit of God inside of you? It's, I wonder why that is. Can you all say that? I wonder why that is. Curiosity. It's the most important tool you have in your belt for studying the Bible. I wonder, why was this word used and not that word used? Why was it said like that? Why was this detail used and not other details? Why are they missing? Curiosity is the most important tool in your tool belt for studying the Bible. And so we're going to ignite our curiosity together. So here's what we're going to do. What I start with is the structure of this introduction. And the structure of this introduction by John is very intentional. It's got three main parts. And here are the three main parts. At the very beginning, you see those 4 different lines. That's the intro to the introduction. And then you have these 6 portions in the middle, and then you have a conclusion. An introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And John is doing this very intentionally, and we'll see why. Let's start with the introduction. The introduction is verse 1 and 2, and it says this. In the beginning was the Word. Debbie, would you go ahead and go to the next slide? Thank you so much. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Now, you'll notice already that I've put colors, I've got underlining, I've got italics, because what I want you to notice is that there are things that are related, things that are compared, things that are contrasted, things that build upon other things. So, for instance, this very first line, in the beginning was the Word, it's beautiful, it's artistic, but it's kind of confusing. In the beginning was the Word. What word? Which word? A lot of great words out there, right? What language was the word in? Is this English? Is this Hebrew? What is this word? And you begin to think, well, that's a little bit confusing. And so John now explains in the next 2 lines a little bit more about the Word. He says, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he says, He was at the beginning with God. This is what John is doing. And we have to think about this, right? We live 2,000 years later, and we have loads of beautiful church history that has helped fill out a lot of the things that are confusing. And so there's a word that many of us know called the Trinity. And what the Trinity means is we believe in a God that is one God, but 3 persons. One God, but 3 persons, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. But you have to understand when John is writing this, they didn't have the word the Trinity. And so John is trying to convey this concept that just blows our mind. It's something we can't really even grasp fully. And he does it like this. He says, in the beginning was the Word. Now, what's a word? When you have a word in your mind or in your brain, it's a part of you, right? It's your word. It's a part of your mind, it's your brain, your emotions, your thought processes. It's a part of you. But once you speak out that word, it also becomes separate from you. And so John says, that's what Jesus is like. He is God, but he's also with God. He is God, but he's not the Father, he's the Son. He begins to paint for us what the Trinity is like. And Jesus is a person. The Word is a person. It's not just some ethereal thing. He was in the beginning with God. Now let's jump into the body. Into the body, you have these 6 different segments that are paralleled. You've got creation and incarnation that are paralleled. You've got witness and witness that are paralleled, and choice that are paralleled. And at the beginning, I wrote Genesis. Now, I wonder why here with creation, we're going to think Genesis. All things came into being through him. And apart from him, this is the Word that was and with God. Apart from him, not even one thing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, And the life was the light of mankind. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not grasp it. Now, when you hear things like the beginning, came into being, light and darkness, what other biblical passage do you think of? The creation account in Genesis chapter 1. And if you were someone in that day and age who knew the Hebrew scriptures, you couldn't help but have your mind jump back to Genesis chapter 1, right? Because this is what it was about. Now, there's a really great word that the NASB uses, and we see it here, and I love it, to translate this Greek word katalambano. This Greek word katalambano has two major forces to it. One is a physical thing, and one is an intellectual thing. You can katalambano something physically, like grab onto someone physically, or defeat someone, or win something like physically, or you can intellectually understand something. It has both meanings. And I think John wants both meanings to be displayed. And the English word grasp really displays it well, because you can physically grasp something, and you can intellectually grasp something. And what he's saying is the darkness has not grasped the light, physically overtaken it, defeated it, confined it, or intellectually understood the light. And we'll see this. Chapter 3, we're going to get to it with Nicodemus. It's going to be brilliant. But let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. Let's kind of refresh our memories about Genesis chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 4. It says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Now, you got to remember back to our series on heaven and earth. The word deep in Hebrew is the word tahom. And what that means is like a dark, scary, chaotic waters. If you're like me and you have a fear of the ocean at night, picture that. It's something that is anti-life. And the Spirit of God was hovering over, not just physically over, but also over in authority and power over the face of the waters, which are now called Hamayim. See, Tahom is dark and scary and chaotic and anti-life, but Hamayim, those are useful waters. Those are waters that you can drink. See, when the Spirit of God is present amongst this dark, chaotic, scary waters, they become useful. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Now think about what John is doing here. The darkness has not grasped the light. See, God confines the darkness. God's Spirit is over the dark waters, and they become useful. Who is more powerful, the darkness or God? God. Who is more powerful, the darkness or now the light, that is the Word who was and was with God? The light. See, God is more powerful, and John is beginning to display this for us. Now, in the second segment of this body, we get a witness. Can I get a witness? Verse 6, a man came, one sent from God, and his name was John. And he came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. Now, this is going to be very important for John moving forward. What was the purpose of the book, John chapter 20? John said, I selected certain signs so that you would what? Believe that Jesus is who? The Messiah, the Son of God. Now, if you wanted to convince somebody of something, what would you give them? It's a word that begins with P. Proof, yeah. And if I was in a court of law and I was trying to confirm my story, one of the best ways to provide proof, or most convincing ways, at least in our society, is to have what called to the stand? A witness. So what John is going to do throughout his book is he's going to provide witnesses for us. It's not just going to be his word. There are going to be other people's words and even Jesus' own miracles that are proof to testify that this is in fact true so that you and I might be able to believe that Jesus is the Messiah and have life in his name. How cool is that? And John testifies about the light. He's the first witness. Now, the third segment of the middle section, verse 9, this was the true light that coming into the world enlightens every person. Okay, a light that enlightens. It makes sense, but once again, that word grasp, that isn't just physical, but also intellectual. The light enlightens. It opens up our minds, right? It enlightens every person. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not accept him. So now you see, know him, accept him, and received him. Those are all in the same color because they're related. They help fill out the picture of what these words mean, okay? And yet the world did not know him. He came to his own people did not accept him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name. Now, believe is the same color as know, accept, and receive because that's related. It helps fills out that portrait of what is being spoken here. Those who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. See, as you study the Bible on your own, you're going to circle things that are related and highlight things that are related and underline things that are related so that you can see visually what things are together, what things are compared, what things are contrasted. It'll help you be a detective, help you be a better Sherlock, okay? So you get your magnifying glass, especially for those of us who need reading glasses, and you look at the word and you find these things and then you mark them, all right? Now, you've got creation, you've got a witness, and now you've got a choice. That when we are confronted with Jesus, we can either receive, accept, and believe and know him, or reject him. Now we see it happen again. Verse 14, this is the fourth section of that middle segment. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, I've got Exodus over this section because John is now using not Genesis language, but Exodus language to display that Jesus is in fact God. And here's what he does. The Word became flesh and dwelt. This Greek word means to dwell in a tent, to pitch a tent. But it's also the word that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, it's the word that they would use for tabernacle. Now, when you hear tabernacle and you hear tent, what do you think of? The tabernacle, which was the portable tent where God's presence dwelt. Okay? It's God's home that was movable. And God's presence dwelt there, and they called it God's glory. So God's glory dwells in this tent that can move around. It's God's movable house where his glory resides. And John says that's what Jesus is. God's movable house where his glory resides, right? He's a person that can move, that can walk, that can talk, that can interact. He's God's glory, but he's portable. Do you see this imagery of John trying to display who Jesus is? It's incredible. It's brilliant. Now, verse 15, the fifth segment. We get a witness again. Same one. John testified about him, calling out, saying, "This was he of whom I said is coming. He who is coming after me has proved to be my superior because he existed before me." Now, this is interesting because if you remember the birth narrative in Luke, who was born first, John or Jesus? John. But John says he existed before me. Because when Jesus was born, this was the incarnation of Jesus, not his beginning. He existed before John, and John is testifying, giving witness to, bearing witness about the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. And then we come up with a choice again, the sixth segment. For of his fullness we all have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. You've got given through and realized through. You've got the law and grace and truth. These things are related. These things are contrasted. But when we encounter Jesus, when we hear witness about Jesus, we are once again confronted with the opportunity to submit and follow Jesus, to believe in him, to know him, to accept him, or to reject him. Now, in the conclusion, John does something really cool. No one has seen God at any time. God, the only Son, who is in the arms of the Father, he has explained, ... Now, in your English translation, it says he has made him known in the ESV. In the NASB, it says he has explained him. But here's the thing. In the Greek, that word him, it's not there. John ends his introduction with an incomplete sentence, with an incomplete thought. I wonder why he would do that. Right? This is curiosity. It's the greatest tool in our tool belt. I wonder why would he put an incomplete sentence to complete his introduction? Well, if you remember the structure of John, if you remember back to when we studied Genesis, chapter 1, there's a very similar structure. See right there, you've got Genesis and you've got John. These are very similar in structure, right? Genesis 1 begins with an introduction. It's got 6 segments or 6 days, and then it's got a conclusion, day 7. Now, what happens, I want to know, does anyone know, what is different about day 7 from days 1 through 6? There's something that is the same on every single day, 1 through 6, that is absent from day 7. Does anyone know what it is? What is it, Dax? He rested, that's different. God rested on the 7th day, and he didn't do that on any other days. But what else? There's a phrase that is the same on every day. God saw something. God saw that it was good, and then there was something and something. There was morning, there was evening, the first day. There was morning, there was evening, the second day. There was morning, evening, the third day. This is a way in Hebrew to explain that there was a completed day. But in day 7, God doesn't step back and say it's good, and there is no morning and evening. So the author of Genesis, writing the very first account of creation, wants us to know that the 7th day is an ideal that's never fully realized. It's an incomplete work of art, which the Hebrew scriptures as a whole are an incomplete work of art. And so John echoes back in the structure of his introduction to Genesis 1, but also in the final segment saying there's an incompletion. There's something that's not finished. And Jesus is the one who explains the fullness of God's character. Jesus is the one who finishes God's story, and we'll see it throughout the book of John. I want to show you. In the book of John, chapter 5, verse 16, it says, "For this reason the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing things on the Sabbath." Now, what's the 7th day called? The Sabbath. Jesus was now doing things on the Sabbath. Now, what did God do on the 7th day? He rested. It says he finished his work. He rested. Now, Jesus was doing things on the Sabbath, but he answered them, because they're mad at him for doing things on the Sabbath, he answered them, "My Father is" what until now? He's what? I thought he rested. I thought he finished. I thought it was complete. How is Jesus saying my Father is working until now? Because it was an ideal that was never fully realized. And I myself am working. And then chapter 4, verse 34, Jesus said to them, "My food is to" what God's work? Finish his work. And then hanging on a cross, being punished for the sins of the world. In his last breath, Jesus says this, verse 30, "It is finished." Completing the introduction that John sets out in chapter 1, verse 18, it is finished. And he gave up his spirit. Jesus is the one who finishes God's story. Jesus is the one who fills out the portrait of what God is like. If you want to know what God is like, look to Jesus. If you want to know how God looks at you, look at Jesus. If you want to know how God treats people, look at the way Jesus treated people. John's sitting there reading Matthew and saying, there's more that's there. There's more you got to hear. You got to see Jesus and the woman in the well, the way he cares for her. You got to see Jesus with the woman caught in adultery. You got to see Jesus with Nicodemus. You've got to see it because I want you to see the full picture of who God is. Jesus is the most full portrait of who God is. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. And we're going to do that throughout the rest of the book of John. But John calls your attention to three major things about Jesus in the introduction. First, that Jesus is the creator God. Secondly, that Jesus is God, not far off, but Emmanuel, God with us, God dwelling among us. And thirdly, lastly, that Jesus is the finisher of God's work, the finisher of God's story, the finisher of God's portrait. But he's not just the finisher of the big picture. As Paul says in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, and I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. I want to invite the band to come back up and help us respond. And as they do, I want you to ponder three things. I want you to ask yourself, how might I need the creational work of Jesus in my life? God's creative work in the person of Jesus, how might I need that in my life today? Secondly, how might I need God's dwelling work in my life today? Maybe you've never known Jesus. Maybe you've never had a personal relationship with Jesus. And if you haven't, I'm going to encourage you as we pray to invite Jesus to be a part of your life, to be the Lord of your life, to dwell with you. But maybe you, like one of the churches in the book of Revelation, maybe you've known Jesus, but maybe he's knocking on the door of your heart and there are places you haven't let him into. That there are deeper places he wants to go, a more intimate relationship he wants to have with you. How might you need the dwelling work of God in Jesus? Or lastly, how might you need the finishing work of God in Jesus? Maybe you look at your life and you're like, man, my life has become complacent. It's become stagnant. I don't see the character of Jesus being formed in me anymore. How might you need Jesus to finish the work that he started in your heart and your mind? And as we sing about Jesus, and as you go your way and as you study the book of John this week, ask yourself those questions. And I believe the Spirit of God wants to use this word to transform your heart and mind. He wants to finish the work that he started. He wants Jesus to dwell in you. And he wants God's creative work to abound in your heart and your mind.